Hey everyone, welcome to episode 25 of The Followers. We've come a long way from episode 1, and this week we have a very exciting guest for you, Orlaith Curran, and she has quite a lot under her belt. So I'm actually going to hand it over to you, Orlaith, to take off and give us a little bit of a background on yourself rather than me butchering it from the get-go.
I suppose I'll just start with education and how that led into work. So I did my undergraduate in DCU. I studied sports science and health there. And then when I finished that, I worked with the GA for a couple of years. But then I really wanted to kind of get into strength and conditioning and gain experience in that field. So I moved to New Zealand and got an internship working over there with the Taranaki Rugby Union. And so I stayed there for about 2.5 years. And while I was there, I did my master's through a university in the UK, so UCLan. And so I did a taught master's, but online, and carried out some research with them. And then I decided to bite the bullet and move home because it was going well over in New Zealand, but I'd either stayed there and keep following that path or try and get my foot in the door in Ireland. So I decided to come back. Went back into the GA for a bit because obviously that was kind of all I knew before I left. And then, like, I'd like to say luck and timing and everything, but that kind of opened up a few doors for me, and I got into hockey. Worked in hockey for a couple of years with the underage, the under-21 girls team, and then at the same time I kind of managed to break into rugby through the Leinster women's team, and then from that I now work with the Irish women's rugby team, which is a part-time role. So I also do some work in UCD in the high performance gym there. So yeah, pretty much worked through rugby and hockey over the last few years. But like I said a couple of seconds ago, GA was really all I knew, and I grew up playing camogie. Dabbled a little bit in football when I got to Dublin, but mostly camogie for my whole life, and still trying to hit a ball around.
Why did you not play football back home?
It doesn't really exist in Kilkenny. Well, not in the little corner that I'm from anyway.
Just back to your degree there in sports science, when you went into that, was strength and conditioning at the start something you wanted to look into, or was it the good overview of all different types of, I think you could ask, what is sports science? But you had exposure to a number of things, and is that the one you felt the most interested in, or were you kind of thinking long-term career-wise, that's where there's possibly more work?
Yeah, I think it wasn't really got to do with career, to be honest. It was kind of when I first went in, I think I was a bit naive and thought strength and conditioning was sports science. And so I went in and obviously after a while came to know that, not that they're two completely separate fields, but they do have their own niches. And so in the course that I did in DCU, there was definitely elements of understanding parts of strength and conditioning, but there was a lot of sports science stuff in there. And I think I found that I really enjoyed the strength and conditioning end of athletic performance and being able to help people to perform on a pitch. Now, doing the sports science degree helped me with that because it helped me to understand the broader picture and how everything works in the background as well. And so I've pulled that through then to things in my career, and especially when I did my internship in New Zealand. Yes, it was a strength and conditioning internship, but I did I fulfilled really a sports science role and kind of shadowed the strength and conditioning coach and got a lot of experience that way. But it was within a sports science role around the likes of GPS, RPEs, looking after all the data management and things like that.
That's interesting then that you say strength and conditioning is kind of a part of sports science, but you fulfill a sports scientist role. Just for anyone who might be kind of slightly outside that bracket or not more exposed to working in what's really full-time sport, what are kind of the main duties of a sports scientist? And I know it can be very broad, but what are kind of the key skills that would be used on a day-to-day basis?
Yeah, like I think it definitely depends on the setup and what your role would be. Like for the experience that I've had anyway, and the roles that I've had, it would be around, again, like that data management. So if it's around performance, depending on what the outputs are, like within rugby, we'd be looking at the GPS, but then any kind of testing data that we might do around, speed testing or jump testing, monitoring, how players are performing on anything that really has numbers, collecting RPEs, So keeping in touch with how players are performing on a weekly basis, on a monthly basis, how it's tracking over the year, maybe how they're performing now compares to how they might perform in games, comparing training to games, things like that. Whereas S&C kind of comes in around where you're trying to really develop that strength, really trying to develop the fitness and prepare them for what's to come on the pitch. And I think they both interact and interplay so much that you have to have the knowledge of both. Whether your role is predominantly one over the other just depends on the sport you're working in and how much resources are there.
Yeah, no, that's sorry, Mar. That's very interesting. I suppose looking at where you are at the moment, in at this point in your career, where you obviously get a good opportunity to mix those together. How have you found that, I suppose, development throughout your career, where the S&C and the sports science, I suppose, interlinking? Do you feel like it is kind of coming closer together, or do you feel there's still a little bit of, I suppose, within Ireland, I suppose, is where I'd be kind of wondering, do you feel they're still kind of not joining up together?
Yeah, I mean, I think I've been lucky in any roles that I've been in so far. They have linked quite well. And if there's been a strength and conditioning coach and a sports scientist as two separate people, generally, for the most part, where I've been, that's always been linked, and they've worked in tandem together with stuff on the pitch or to influence whatever's happening on the pitch. But there's definitely, I've heard of other stories where, sports scientists kind of sits on their own with the laptop and the data, and sometimes, they're spending all that time crunching numbers and it just sits there and nothing's done with it. So I think it depends on the environment, it depends on the relationships between, your sports scientist and your strength and conditioning coach. But when I did my internship and when we were, when I was gaining a lot of my experience, there was the S&C coach was there, and I obviously did all the sports science data analysis and whatnot, but he was really interested in what that data said and having conversations, and he helped me to learn a lot about it and how it would apply to on the pitch. And so I kind of took that approach in the years that followed into all the other roles that I went on to. And I was lucky when I came back from New Zealand that I started working with the hockey, where I was S&C and sports science all rolled into one, and I had no choice but to do it all. And then I came into the rugby, and it's a similar enough scenario, but I do have a sports scientist, and Beth is great in that she helps me with the GPS and everything. But predominantly I'm in charge then as the S&C coach of how everything is influencing how they perform on the pitch physically. And so if I'm not having those conversations with the sports scientist and what she's seeing in the data, then you're not looking at it from every angle, Yeah,
I think it's so important in that kind of relationship that, as you said, like, you are the main S&C, but you have some sort of knowledge of sports science, and vice versa. I think when the problems arise is when, say, like you said, if you have a sports scientist who just cares about the numbers, not how they're generated or not the players themselves, or if you have an S&C who doesn't care about data or doesn't want to use that, they're just kind of stuck in their ways. So I think, obviously, it doesn't have to be a full degree, everyone has to do it in sports science, but I think having some education for both sides, but just makes that relationship so much smoother. Yeah,
and I think it depends on the role that you're given as well. Like if I'm the S&C coach with a team and my role is they have to be as strong as they can be, so as strong as you can get them, and I want them as fit as you can get them, then absolutely let me go and do that. But if it's a case that your role then ties in with actually having them, prepped and primed for what's to come each week, or being able to perform on a weekly basis, recover, and then repeat it and still be in peak performance 6 weeks later, then you have to have that sports science understanding. And you have to be able to look at the data to make decisions based off what's happening on the pitch. And I think that's where the interplay comes in. So it depends on your role and what role you've been given. If you're just purely an S&C coach, or if you're a performance coach that has to look after that weekly performance element, then you have to understand the sports science part behind it.
And does knowledge of the sport itself, so like you came from a camogie background but have worked largely in rugby and hockey, have you done a lot then on upskilling your knowledge around either of those two sports to be able to apply either sports science or S&C style stuff, or have you tried to remain in some bit objective to just more physical end of things?
Yeah, I think you definitely do need a knowledge of the sport. like, don't get me wrong, I came into rugby and into hockey with zero knowledge. So I learned it as I went. Like when I went over to New Zealand first, like I think if I look back, I'd laugh at the little knowledge I had of rugby. And I think they knew it as soon as I arrived. And it was the first thing I said in my interview. I was like, I know you have to throw it backwards. After that, I know nothing. But luckily enough, the S&C coach that took me on, he was sound, and he was a Scottish guy. And his actual nickname was Shadow because he had started as an intern, and the S&C coach that he was following around called him his shadow. And so he was good in that sense. He'd gone through the same kind of progression. So I learned a lot about the sport as I went. And I think you have to come in with the knowledge of physical prep, and you have to come in with the knowledge of, okay, sport, field sport. You've got some understanding of, what the demands of a game might be. Yes, the rules and how it's played and whatnot will change the specifics of what you do, but you do have to have that base knowledge, and that'll always stay the same no matter what sport you're in or where you go with it. And then definitely the real detail within the sports is going to have an effect on the real specifics when you get into that sport specific prep, or as you get closer to competition, definitely.
And if you were to go back now, say Brian Dowden, isn't it, Kilkenny Camogie manager, rang you in the morning and said, okay, all this experience you have from hockey and rugby as a sports scientist and as an S&C coach, I want you to come in with Kilkenny next year. What are some of the things you've maybe learned from those, with a kind of a different perspective, would you think you could possibly bring back to a game like Camogie or hurling?
Yeah, that's interesting. I've never actually even thought of that. Probably, hockey, what I've got from hockey is kind of understanding the higher limits of fitness that females, especially because that's what I've worked in, the higher limits that they could reach and achieve, and the numbers that they can hit on GPS, which I think if you told me beforehand I wouldn't have believed you, whereas now knowing that and how that might compare to Camogie and what they might be able to do on a pitch, I wouldn't go in underselling what they can do. And so it's to try and help females then in that sense get to that ceiling level of fitness, and how that can impact on a game. And then I think from the rugby end, I've definitely gained a lot around the physicality, and what and again, like I've worked in male sport and female sport, but understanding what those females can do. And yes, it's a different element because you have contact and a lot more contact in rugby, but then it's that understanding of how that strength base behind it influences and impacts them on the pitch, and how that can influence and impact a camogie player who maybe isn't going to be as physical as a rugby player, but it'll stand to them in their performance and how they might compete for a ball on a pitch. So I don't think S&C is as prevalent in the camogie world as it probably could be, and I think it could have a huge influence. So I'd 100% take some learnings from both hockey and rugby. It's like camogie, I think, kind of sits in the middle of the two of them. So yeah, call me. Go away, Brian Dowling.
I actually found that exact same thing with hockey. To be honest, I haven't worked too much in it, but the fitness levels are astronomical in hockey that I never would, before, I don't have much of a knowledge of the sport itself, but before going into it, I never would have assumed they're as high. But hands down, the fittest athletes I've ever worked with, they're absolutely incredible.
Yeah, and they train a lot and for a long time. And I remember, because I was with the under-21s girls, so in my head they were still developing, they weren't fully developed, and the length of a training session and the amount of training sessions they would have, I was, these girls are going to fall apart, but they didn't, and they were robust enough to it because they'd been doing it for so long. But yeah, it's crazy the level of fitness that they need for that sport, especially because it's a tournament style sport as well. So they have to be able to back it up day in, day out over the course of a week or 6 days or whatever it is.
Just to bring it back to your time then in New Zealand, and I remember chatting to you a couple of years ago about this, that your masters, it was taught, but you still had a decent research element to it when you're looking at the elite performance. But you looked quite a bit there at how GPS can inform coaching practice and stuff like that. So before we dig a bit deeper into that, just because a few of us have a bit of experience here using GPS, we know that a few teams, when they have a bit of money, they might look to purchase a set of GPS units, or some individual players themselves may go buy a pod to inform their training, their matches, their performances, whatever like that. What are some of, at a very basic level, someone just starting out, what are some of the key things you might look at in terms of the data you're getting back on a GPS unit? And then we might look at some of the more advanced stuff you could look into over time.
Yeah, so looking at just the basics, that was all we did in my research. We just really looked at the basic stuff. I was working in rugby sevens at the time. Well, the data that I used was with the rugby sevens team that I was with, and we looked at the data we were collecting in training and how that compares to games. So that was as simple as total distance, as well as total distance in your higher speed zones, and what the relative distance might be, so the meters per minute, and what that looked like over an entire training session. Looking at, generally we looked at the relative, so the meters per minute, so what that looked like in a training session and what it looked like in a game or over a game day, because obviously in sevens, they might have played 3 games in a day back to back. So we kind of looked at what were the intensities in the games and what were the intensities that we were hitting in our training sessions. And generally we found that the training sessions intensities was much lower than, just on a meters per minute value, was much lower than what we were hitting in the games. Now, if we broke it down into specific, like a 5-minute clip of a small sided game versus the training session, then okay, we were probably hitting it for, whatever it was, 2 minutes of the game versus 2 minutes of, 2 minutes of the training game versus 2 minutes of the sevens game, which was good. But over the course of the training session, the intensity over 40 minutes or 45 minutes, whatever it was way down compared to the tournament day, for example. And so we found then, when we broke down the data, that we had big gaps in between our drills and big gaps of low intensity in between our games. Whereas in sevens, they don't get that time to drop the intensity. And when we reflected on it, we kind of felt that we were spending, we'd start to give feedback, aiming in our head for 20-30 seconds, and it quickly turned into 3 and 4 minutes. And so the girls wouldn't necessarily cool down, essentially, because it was summertime over there, but they were static for too often, and then to get the intensity back up would take too long. And so we kind of used that then to just have some feedback with the coaches, in that, can we put a timer on the feedback so that you have to do it as concise as possible? They take in that quick information and we go back into whatever game or drill we were doing. And so we started that in the sevens, and it worked quite well. And we spoke to the 15s guys as well, and we said, look, this is what our data is coming out with. I wonder, is it the same in the 15s? And we looked at it, and the similar thing was happening with the 15s team. And so the head coach decided, okay, great, we'd have earpieces in training and stuff as well. And so he said, as soon as we come in for this feedback, I want you to tell me I have 60 seconds. So I'd go in the microphone, okay, 60 seconds now. After 30 seconds, I'd be like halfway through, and whatever, 10 seconds to go, I'd give him a little nudge, like 10 seconds left. And he then got better at having to give the best bit of advice he could in the shortest bit of time, right? And then it ended up being a case of just let the players play and let them get on with it and learn as they go. Quick piece of feedback and go back into it. And we found that when we looked at the data as well, when a game started to break down, it was, okay, blow the whistle, go in, give the feedback, talk for 5 minutes, let them go again for 2 minutes. Break down, go in, talk for 5 minutes, let them go again for 2 minutes. So the balance of talking and training was not what they thought it was until we showed it to them on the data. And so that kind of flipped, and it changed how much time we were playing rugby and how much time we were talking about playing rugby, if that makes sense. And I think that was a big learning curve, and it helped then, rather than jumping in after 2 minutes, give the lads another 2 minutes to just figure it out. And by the time it came to the feedback stage, they only really needed a minute because the lads had already fixed a lot of it already. And so that worked really well. That conversation stimulated from the data that we had collected and looked at for the research. So I don't know if I answered your question there, John.
No, that's really interesting. Just the meters per minute, when I'd been using GPS4, that was the main thing I was looking at as well. That and kind of just general demands of high speed meters. Overall distance was, I found, largely irrelevant. Just you kind of had a general idea per position on the field, but other than that, it wasn't that important. What were you finding? Say, what was kind of the average game speed, as it's often known, or meters per minute of a rugby sevens game?
Oh my god, I have to think back to my data. It was around, oh my god, high 90s, I think it was. Yeah,
that is high. Yeah, I remember looking at a few different sports. I think Intercounty Hurling Division 1B is around 95 to 105 meters per minute. At Division 1A, Liam McCarthy, then it'd be 110 or upwards. Intercounty football, you're up above 120 meters per minute there.
Yeah,
Whereas I
no.
think rugby union would be around 85 meters per minute, I think.
Yeah, like hockey would be up around 120-ish.
Would it?
Yeah. Yeah, they'd cover a lot. But yeah, that was what our data brought out anyway. But we obviously, there's other stuff that we would look at within the GPS, and then that's where you get into your more specifics around max speed and looking at velocity exposures and all that kind of stuff. But if I was someone in a club just buying a GPS for the first time and I wanted to look at it, start there where you can look at how does our meters per minute compare to a game over a training session, or if we're playing a 20-minute conditioned game or whatever it is, how does those meters per minute look against the first half of a hurling match or a football match or whatever it is. And then if the meters per minute is down over the 20 minutes of the game, is that because the intensity isn't there, or is it because you're jumping in and breaking the drill down every 2 minutes to shout at the lads or to give them feedback, and it's slowing it down essentially? So it depends on what you want to get out of it.
And the GPS you were using, was that giving you live stuff, or were you looking retrospectively back?
No, that was retrospectively. Back then it was retrospectively when we were doing it. Now we look at it live. But then it was retrospective.
And the live stuff, do you use that to give real-time feedback, or would you use that kind of more in games to see if someone massively dropping off or whatever?
In the hockey, I would have used it in games, and mostly to see like that, because it's so intense and the girls would cover such mad high-speed meters over a short period of time. We'd use it to kind of say, look, this player, well, I'd inform the coach and I'd say they've already covered X number of high-speed meters, or they've sprinted whatever many times in the last couple of minutes. And because it's unlimited rolling subs, we had the luxury of, okay, take her off and throw in somebody else, and then 3 minutes later they might get rolled back on again. So we used it that way a few times. Now, he didn't live by it, and it just depended, because it might have been a case of, there's a bit of a break coming, or there was a short corner at the other end, so they're going to get a rest now, so leave her on. Whereas the rugby, it doesn't really influence too much the game stuff, but I would look at it a lot in the training session, because we might have targets on what we'd like to hit in the training session, so checking to see, are we hitting it, or if it's a case that we know we need to cover a certain amount of high speed meters to get a good conditioning element out of it, and if they don't hit it, then at the end we can provide top-ups, or if it's a case that we maybe or maybe underestimated what the training session would be, and the girls had hit it quite early, then I'd give feedback into the coaches, hey look, we're after overshooting here, we're already at X, let's maybe slow down or cut the training early, and we've done that before as well.
Just something that crossed my mind there. If you're thinking, say, on your data there, where you're able to kind of get a good idea of the amount of time that was spent coaching, in between drills and in between bouts of exercise, that I'm just wondering, say, if you pulled it back to the amateur settings that we see in Ireland with our hurling, football, and club rugby, and that, did you find that you were able to, by cutting down that coaching time, you were able to increase the volume of training, or did you find that actually the length of training time just dropped down because you were cutting out a lot of the chat from coaching? I suppose where I'm coming at this from is looking at it from the amateur team perspective, where you still would see that length of time in between drills. And I suppose with a lot of amateur sport, the training is in the evenings after work, and you've guys hanging around fields until 9:30, 10 o'clock at night, when realistically they should be at home recovering, getting ready for bed and stuff. And I found that a lot of that kind of stuff, a lot of the coaching points push training on for a long time. But how did you approach the extra time you cut off the coaching? Did it just mean volume increase, or did it just mean just better quality, shorter training sessions?
Yeah, the training sessions did shorten a bit. Now, not a huge amount. I think they definitely had ball in hand a lot more, and a 5-minute spell that you might want in a game, rather than that 5 minute lasting for actually 8 minutes, because we broke it down in the middle and chatted. It was just the 5 minutes. Now they'd still, they'd have 2 minutes in between games for getting water and getting breaks and whatnot. They're obviously, there's a time and place where you don't want the whole training to be at a very high intensity all the time, because it's not sustainable, and you do have to give them that breaks, but it's those breaks when they're warranted, as opposed to just butting in and coaching where maybe just let them play and let them just, rectify mistakes before you jump in. And we got better quality training, and so it didn't need to extend by 10 minutes. We might have planned 70 minutes that ended up being maybe 85 minutes, but actually we were then able to just stick to our 70 minutes. So yeah, I've done a little bit of it with the Irish girls at the moment as well, where we've had that feedback with coaches where it might have been a case of, hey, actually this week and last week we've definitely spent way more time on feedback and coaching, and particularly in winter when the weather is really cold and you're trying to keep that intensity there between drills or between games. That was when we found if we shortened it or they were conscious of it, it worked for us. Now, don't get me wrong, there's times where you have to coach and there's times where you have to give feedback and you have to maybe make a teaching point, and it can't be done in 30 seconds, 100%. But there's times and places for certain things, and it's to be aware of that and pick your time,
Did you find much pushback from kind of head coaches, from not that you were dictating more of the session, but kind of around that, telling them what to do or telling them to cut down their coaching process with anyone you kind of work with?
No, and I've been really lucky with the coaches that I've worked with. I have no stories like that at all. But I think as well as that, I would never have just come to a coach saying, hey, this is what I think. It was more like, if I'm going to approach the subject, I'll talk with, here's the evidence and this is what we're finding. What do you think about such and such? I reckon if we cut, blah, blah, whatever. And then we'd have that conversation. I'm not a very authoritative person, so I don't try and jump in with do it this way. I'll rather, give the evidence and have a chat about it. Unless I'm in the gym with the girls and I have to shout at them, then I'm a different person, but you know what I mean?
To be fair, once you're at that level, there's a high likelihood the coach is going to be open to feedback enough and will look to be as informed from as many different areas as possible to make the best decisions ultimately for the team and the training and everything that way. Just on conciseness of feedback there, I remember seeing a presentation by, I think, Chris Cushion from University of Birmingham, I think, a couple of years ago. He encouraged me to do it a few times, but bring a stopwatch with you to train, particularly when you're acting as skills coach or whatever like that. And every time you speak, press start. And every time you stop speaking, press stop. And just look at it at the end of the training session. I think the first time it was up around 20 minutes. And over the course of that season, I was looking at it, eventually cut it down to 6 minutes. But even so, like, what could I possibly have been saying for 6 minutes, like across the session, that was that worthwhile? But something that is worth tying into your own training at some stage.
Yeah, and so I give reports on the GPS back to the coaches, and there was one day we wrote down the minutes totted up of talking time or feedback time, and they couldn't believe it either.
Two things just coming from your GPS stuff to pull it back there as well. One thing I found really useful, again, bringing it back to kind of the amateur and the retrospective stuff as well, is to spend a bit of your pre-season trialing different games. So like just saying, I'm playing this game for 4 minutes and I'm going to see what kind of outputs that game gives me. And if it's 4v4, 8v8 on whatever size pitch. And then next week, same playing numbers, the same length of time, but change the size of the pitch or slightly change the rules. And as you go through a block of pre-season, it could give you 8 or 10 games that'll all give you slightly different outputs. One game will give you, really high meters per minute. The players will be wrecked after it, and they'll cover decent distances on a wide pitch. Then you shorten the pitch down, far more fatigue from the players. Not as much overall distance, but the same fatigue, but more twisting and turning. And it's worth having a bank of those then that you can draw on in the season when you want to top up bits of fitness and stuff like that. Something you mentioned there as well, Orla, was that if they hadn't hit some of the targets, you would use top-ups. What do you mean by top-ups, or what would be a few examples of that?
Yeah, so we'd have, every week we'd kind of look at, in total this week, what's, total distance in certain speed zones that they would have covered. And so if we're looking at that from a week-to-week basis, we obviously don't want them to spike in their load, and we don't want them to drop too much unless it's planned, and then we can slowly bring them back up again. So if it's a case that on Saturday, Sunday, we're coming towards the end of the week, we kind of know what meters we want them to cover in their certain speed zones. And if we play a lot of games, say, in training, depending on your position, I suppose, particularly in rugby, will kind of determine how much meters in those zones that you can hit, and depending on the game, just like what you were saying there, John. So at the end, if there's some girls that maybe haven't had the opportunity to gain those meters in those games, but we want to keep keep the stimulus or the conditioning element there for them, then we'll add some runs in at the end to try and build up those meters, so that it's not a case of, if we're looking at their data over a month, that they covered really high meters one week, not a lot the next week, not a lot the next week, and then really high the week after. We try and keep them somewhat along a similar trajectory as we go along. So yeah, that's kind of what I meant by that. They hate it when we tell them, but they get through it all the same.
Yeah, I can even imagine from different positions. Like when I was younger, I played rugby. I was fairly used to that. But like I was playing the wing or full back, and some days like the biggest job I had was trying to keep myself warm. It was so cold, and then you'd have this odd game where you're tripling the amount of stuff you're doing in the game.
Yeah.
Can I ask just a little bit on your, I suppose, experience of working with both men and women's teams? Like often I'll come across, I suppose, people who come to me with different programs they've been given, women especially, where they're kind of treated like mini men. And I'm just wondering, have you noticed any big changes or big differences? In how you should approach like a men's game. Say if we look at rugby versus the women's game, or do you feel that there's along similar lines?
Yeah, like I do think there's differences there, but they're probably more similar than different. In a lot of ways, the game is quite similar, so the demands are quite similar. The differences, I think, come in, particularly with our group at the moment, in that training age and what they're actually able for, and what they've experienced already. In comparison to, if you think about it, I'm working with a senior international women's team, and their training age is so different to the men's international team. So if I was the S&C coach for that team and a new guy comes into my group, then I know they've probably most likely gone through academies and they've had all this S&C background. Whereas a girl might come into me next week, for example, she might join the team and has probably only a year's worth or a few weeks worth of S&C done over the past couple of years. And so it's very different how you approach it that way. So training age is always different. Now, with the way things are going, I reckon in 10 years' time, training age won't be as big of a difference, hopefully, between males and females, but currently it is. The other thing then is around, I find with our girls, they tend to have not similar injury patterns, but there's definitely areas that I like to make sure are kept healthy. So with our girls, for example, we'll always try and keep knees healthy, and that landing and those balance works, just because of the data that's out there on it for females. And you can see it in them as well. A lot of times if they haven't been taught to run properly, or they haven't been taught to land properly, and they're probably in their 20s, so it's something to really keep an eye on. With regards to
could you break that down for us a bit further, like some of that data around knees, like what are the pitfalls, what are we concerned about there, and what's some of the stuff we can do to be proactive about preventing what's likely to happen?
Yeah, I mean, like the likes of ACL injuries and whatnot is supposedly more predominant in females, and particularly it happens on landings, and I reckon a lot of it is down to not having the strength behind them, so strength around the knee, so in the knee joint, but then you've got a bigger Q angle for females as well, and it depends on the female. They're all different, so the angle from the hip to the knee, and the bigger that angle is, generally the more knee collapse that you get, and if the knee collapse happens, then they're more susceptible to injury as well. Now there's some girls in our squad that I would put in that box more so than others. They'll come in, some of them are I've worked with females in the past where their ability and quality of exercises are really good, and then there's others where they need a lot of training, and it's the same in males as well. I've worked with boys academies, and the same thing. You've got to really put a lot of attention into some of them, and others are well able to lift, so there's no difference there. Probably how you coach them is a little bit different. So I know with the girls that I work with, whether that was in the hockey or the rugby, a lot of times they'll do exactly what you ask them to do, they'll do exactly what you tell them to do, but they'll keep looking for more until they really have that grasp or understanding of what it's going to do to help them. Why is it going to benefit them? why should I be squatting, or why should I be jumping, or what does this help me to do on the pitch? Whereas lads, I felt I'd give them a programme, show them how to do it. Yeah, grand, I'll do that. And that was just the difference that I found. Whereas the actual strength gain and ability to get stronger and the ability to get faster, I don't find there's much difference in that. Yeah, okay, I think the ceiling of speed or fitness for men is much higher than females. But does that mean females can't get faster? Yes, they can. Does that mean males, they both can get faster, they both can get stronger, they both can be powerful, but obviously at different absolute terms. And then there's the big grey area that's out there at the moment around menstrual cycle. And I don't think there's enough data and enough research out there to hang your hat on anything that it's really saying at the moment. But it's something that, you know, we track in the girls, and it's something that we look at and consider. But again, it doesn't hugely influence what we do in training or anything at the moment. We keep an eye on it, and generally I find with them, there is certain times of the month that they seem to be a little bit more fatigued and they don't recover as well. And all I do with that is try and educate the girls on potentially what it might mean, and then what they need to do to help themselves around those times.
That's very interesting, because as cognizant of it as you may be in terms of planning training, like there's going to be huge individual variability as to where every individual player is at in terms of the monthly cycle, but also you're completely bound to the schedule of when games are, so you can't adapt to that. So while if someone is just training, only focused on training, and that's it, not optimize their complete fitness, they can completely manipulate stuff around that. But because you always have to be mindful of when the next game is and when a game is likely to occur, you can't be that flexible around it either.
Yeah, no, and especially in a team sport, like it's impossible. You're never going to keep everyone happy in that sense. So I've come at it from the sense of just educating them around it, and we'll track their menstrual cycle mostly just so we can have the conversation. Not that it's actually going to influence a huge amount, but the conversation is there. It forces them to track it and be aware of it themselves. Yes, there's research out there that says, you know, in certain weeks they can work on their strength training more, and in other weeks they should work on their endurance element more. But I don't think there's enough out there to actually say that is the way. But definitely I've noticed with our group, generally when it's the last few days of their cycle, they do tend to be that little bit more fatigued or less able to recover between sessions. And then that's just something for me to be aware of. If that's tying in with them reporting feeling tired and not sleeping great, then I just have a conversation with them and tell them, well, look, this is linking up. So if you feel that maybe you need to reduce that running session or reduce that gym session to help, I'm happy for that for the next few days, and then we can figure it out the following week.
In terms of your role then with Irish Rugby, like how hands-on is that? Say, like if you look at the Irish Rugby team, they're in camp for a few weeks at a time, and then they're back to Leinster or Munster or Ulster or Connacht, wherever it may be, for a few weeks' time. And I'm going to assume there's a lot of communication between who is leading the Irish camps and who's leading the day-to-day in the province and stuff. How is that different with the ladies team, particularly because most of them have full-time jobs as well?
Yeah, so there's never really any, it's continuous. It's the whole year. There's never really a hand back to the province, just because they don't have, it's not set up that way. So generally I'll lead their strength and conditioning for the 12 months. And we'll be in the gym all year round, for the most part, depending, like they'll have an off season and whatnot as well. But generally I'll be with them in the gym twice a week. Especially in build up to competition, they'll get some time off, but that time off is a bit of rest and recovery, and then we come back in and we go through it again. So we'll generally stay within the program. So that'll be kind of the difference there.
Are most of those sessions based in Dublin, or do you have to travel around the country and stuff like in normal times now? Obviously not now.
Yeah, no, at the moment normal times as well. I'm based in Dublin, and we've got a regional S&C coaches that will cover the sessions in the provinces, and then I'll link in with them.
So is that like all of the girls who play in Munster go together, or is there even more split? Is it like a Cork and a Limerick? Or?
We have a Limerick contingent, and then we've a girl in Kerry, so she does her own, and then we've got the Limerick contingent. The majority of girls are in Dublin, and then there's a few obviously over in the UK, and so the girls in the UK will follow what their clubs give them.
Damien's there is volunteering for a job with the girl based in Kerry. How much input would you have then, say, in pitch sessions? Is that largely rugby skills focused, tactical focused, or are you doing some elements of, I suppose, standalone conditioning there then as well?
Yeah, I mean, it depends on the time of the year. So when we came back from lockdown, the initial lockdown, and we were over the summer period and whatnot, where there was time to actually build up fitness, then I had some parts to play in training where I was given conditioning blocks and I could do that with them. Now that we were supposedly getting ready for Six Nations, then it's predominantly rugby and it's all done through that. So it depends on the time of the year, but yeah, if it's a pre-season element, then I get given time there. But I'll be at every training session anyway, and I'll be keeping an eye on the GPS stuff, and I'll be chatting to the coaches, and we'll be looking at, how are the bodies actually showing up halfway through the session compared to where we maybe thought they would have been. So if they're actually looking quite fatigued halfway through, then maybe the session is a little bit tougher than we had actually anticipated it to be. And so I'll keep track of the coaches that way. I'll keep them on time as well. If they've planned 15 minutes for a game, making sure that doesn't push out to 25 minutes unless they're going to take 10 minutes off something else later on. And like you were talking about earlier, how it's not a case of training just going on and on and on because we're adding 5 minutes to this drill. We'll add 5 minutes because it's going well. If they add it, they have to take it off somewhere else. Because we're conscious of time on feet, and you have to think, like with our group, it's a little bit different. We have our trainings on the weekend, so we'll have Saturdays and Sundays, and normally we'll train Saturday morning, Saturday evening, or Saturday afternoon, then Sunday morning, Sunday afternoon. So that time on feet and the time training is massive, so we have to keep an eye on it. Over the weekend they could cover anywhere from 15 to 18 kilometres. And then they have other stuff to do during the week. So it's been really cognizant of what that breakdown looks like over the weekend.
How hard is it to manage recovery then?
Oh, massively hard. Particularly for this group. So they spend all weekend, Saturday and Sunday, training. And then Monday is their recovery day. And I'll tell them that they need to try and recover. But they're getting up early and they're going to work. And I know a lot of them are probably working at home at the moment, but for the most part, they're up, they're doing stuff, they're working all day, and then by Monday evening, they're shattered still from the weekend. And then Tuesday we come in and we have gym, and there'll be skills, and the girls that are in Dublin essentially get the skills, and the girls that are outside Dublin, because there's not too many of them, we don't have skills elements for them, so they'll have a bit of running and whatnot to do. So yeah, the recovery element is definitely a hard one to get right with the group. We're definitely getting better at it, and the more we get to know them and what they're able to tolerate, we're improving all the time with it. But it's one that I'm always harping on about, and one that is probably a work on for all of them.
And realistically, no matter how much data you collect, it's about having those conversations with players that you're going to find out so much more from in terms of being recovered, being fatigued, what kind of stimulus they need to excel and stuff as well.
Yeah, 100%. And I get them to do wellness check-ins and wellness monitoring every day. And I think at the start, when I introduced it to them, they were all looking at me like I was mad, and oh my God, if we'd fill that thing in every day. But it's just such a good conversation starter. It's a tool that I use to send a quick message, hey, saw this on your wellness, and we'll have a chat about it. And whether it's that they're feeling fatigued, or maybe they didn't sleep well, or appetite is gone, or whatever, and it just helps me to have that conversation and make those decisions around what they should be doing today or this week, or what needs to change.
I find in that capacity, programming for female athletes is usually kind of much easier than for male athletes, because of that reason. Like, the feedback is always so much better, and there's so much, like, for example with RPR scores, that's usually when they come in for the lads, it'll be like 6 if it's a running session, 6 if it's a gym session, 6 if I try to kill them, 6 if I just let them sleep. Like, it's just consistently they'll put it in for the sake of it, whereas women will actually tell you, okay, I found this session difficult because, or this is happening. I find it a lot easier to get feedback and then use that feedback to kind of tailor sessions more to them. Whereas for lad athletes, I just find it's much more of a like, right, I'm just going to say that it's not tiring me out too much. It's not too much, like, I just keep a steady heel, don't disrupt the boat kind of thing.
Yeah, and I think a lot of that comes back to what I was saying earlier around what I found when coaching female athletes is that as long as they understand how it's benefiting them and they buy into it, then they're all about it. So my biggest thing with them is I always try and educate them around why we're doing something. I won't do something just for the sake of doing it. If I'm going to bring something in like RPE or like that, wellness or whatever, it's letting them know why we do it and what benefit comes from it. And once they click into that and they know what it's about, they'll generally give you the information then, or they'll do it to the best that they can because they know it's going to benefit them. Whereas a lot of times I find, and it's not to say that male athletes are not as tuned in or anything like that, but I just think the mind works a little bit different. It'll be a means to an end as opposed to, oh, that's because that leads on to this, which is going to help me for this. And like, women will always try and think 3 steps ahead. Whether it's they're thinking the right thing or not is dependent on the individual. And so, yeah, I do think they probably are really forthcoming with information in that sense. Sometimes I'll get information that I can't do anything with it anyway, but at least they're willing to give it, and they'll have that conversation. And I think it's hard, I find it hard now to relate it to lads because I've worked with females more so predominantly in the last 3-4 years. I have to go back probably maybe 3 years since I've worked with a men's team. But that's what I found in the last few years anyway.
In those wellness questionnaires, just really briefly, what kind of stuff are you asking there for anyone who wouldn't understand what they might be?
Yeah, generally hours sleep, quality of sleep, how fatigued or recovered they might be feeling. I'll ask about appetite, just rating it out of 10. Everything we'll do is rate it out of 10, and then I'll ask about stiffness and soreness. So just really simple, takes them 20 seconds to fill it in.
And you imagine that on like Google Forms, or do you have a specific app for it?
We have a specific app for it, yeah. But in the past, I would have used Google Forms, yeah.
Nice, cheap and effective one for anyone who wants to try it with their team. Last thing then we'll kind of touch on then is your work with underage hockey and particularly your own research around that. So if you give us an overview of what kind of stuff you've dug into, some of the data you've collected, and ultimately where you're trying to bring it towards, both through your PhD, but ultimately how it informs the wider hockey development world.
Yeah, so I started with the under-21s in a strength and conditioning / sports science role, and I did that for about a year before I kind of started to really collect data for research. And so my PhD with them kind of focuses around the entire hockey development pathway, essentially. So I was with just the under-21s, but the data I've collected has been across the whole pathway. So I'm looking at talent development in the female side of youth hockey in Ireland. And so that kind of encompasses the environment. So the environment that Hockey Ireland has set up around the underage teams, as well as then how that might filter out to the clubs and the schools. And then I'm looking at the physical development of that junior grade. So the junior grade being that development team of under-21s, 23s as they step up into senior. And then we're looking at some psychological competencies and psychological characteristics that are, present in our current under-16s, 18s, 21s, and how that is different to maybe what the senior level is at. And then how can we better probably develop those characteristics in those girls as they progress through the pathway. So it's kind of looking at that pathway as a whole, and trying to give as much feedback or insights to Hockey Ireland and maybe how they can improve it, if that makes sense.
And your supervisors for that are?
Anya McNamara and Dave Passmore in DCU.
Yes, Dave be very experienced just in hockey coaching in general. He runs the DCU coaching masterclass, isn't it?
Yeah, he's done the masterclasses now for the last few years. He's got so many years of experience coaching behind him, so yeah, it's good insights to have.
And then Anya.
So then Anya she'd be an expert in talent development, talent ID, that kind of, talent development, that whole area. So it's good to have her in my corner. She kind of leads me in the right way, and anything I get confused on, she'll help give me some insights on what it means.
Yeah, Anya would have done an awful lot of work around like the Rocky Road is one of her main features of her previous research. I think she helped write the Lifting the Treaty document back in 2010-11 with Limerick there before they went on their huge success they're having now. I know she was involved in a similar one in Offaly, which they're struggling to implement at the minute, and she's informed an awful lot in terms of Leinster Council, their Turris coach development programme there as well. Were you around actually? Were you working GA when that started?
The Turris.
Yeah,
that was since I've come back. And And so with hockey, it's with Hockey Ireland, what we're trying to do is something similar. So it's to have that whole idea of the environment and having the systematic development set up within the whole pathway, but then understanding from that physical development at the higher end of the pathway, so the 21s leading into the seniors, and then looking at the psychological competencies that go along the pathway as well. And the only kind of data, well, I've collected all GPS data. I'm trying to analyse that at the moment. My head's a bit melted trying to get it done. But the talent development environment one is the one that I've collected probably the most data on, and we've already analysed it and trying to get it published. But it's given us really good insights into the pathway, and that everybody understands long-term development, and everybody understands that has to be the key when you're trying to develop kids right the way through to senior. And it's hugely evident in the hockey pathway at the moment, but probably the biggest thing that isn't evident is having that clear strategy and agreement and coherence amongst all the coaches on the pathway, and then between clubs and school levels into the Ireland development section as well. And if they're not all on the same page, and if they're not all trying to develop towards the same thing or the same idea, then everyone's just in doing their own thing and hoping that it all comes together. So that was kind of the big gap that we found, and that was feedback that we gave back to Hockey Ireland, and they're now trying to improve the pathway and put it together so that it can develop and become more strategic in the years to come.
And what way did you collect all that stuff? Is that like questionnaire based, interview based?
Yeah, so I did a questionnaire with the players of each of the teams as well as the coaches, and then we did follow-up focus groups with the players and the coaches, and included some schools and club coaches as well, and just kind of pulled all of the data together then.
Were they largely open-ended questionnaires, or?
The questionnaire it's a validated questionnaire called the Talent Development Environment Questionnaire. So used that questionnaire and then based our focus group interview questions essentially off that.
In terms then of because there are obviously a number of different models for like talent development in various sports and different countries and everything that way, but long term, will a talent development in hockey be similar more so to like say the schools rugby system in Ireland, or will it be more like a GA style model or some kind of hybrid in between the two?
Yeah, so the way that they work is it's similar enough to the rugby in that when girls get into secondary school, they generally play with their school, and that's where a lot of the hockey would take place. And then when they finish school, they get out into their adult clubs, and the underage club then goes through with underage development. Now there is club at the teenage level as well, but generally they'll play either with their school or the club, if that makes sense.
You have to make a choice between the two.
Yeah, so then it's to try and get as best development as possible along those grades, so that if a 15, 16, 17-year-old then makes the step up into the Irish pathway, it's not this, okay, it's going to be a big step in physical, and definitely technical tackle as well, but so that it's not something completely new, so that they've heard some of the terms before, that they understand the style of play, and they understand maybe what's needed of them at those levels. So that's kind of where the systematic development comes in. And that'd be the type of pathway then, so that if you had a 15-year-old playing with under 16 Ireland, for example, and they maybe didn't progress to the next stage straight away and they dropped back out, they're still going to get enough development in the clubs and schools system, so that if they jumped back in at under 21s and they've missed that under 18 block at the international level, they haven't missed a huge amount of development. That would be the aim, is that you can have some kind of fluidity in the pathway that way, and there's not this massive gap in coaching, and in, like, obviously you're going to have a gap in the physicality and the pace of play and whatnot, but it's that difference in maybe the language that they're hearing, or that gap in how they're being taught to step up in levels from age groups, and also from, say, club into province into international.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. It's something I would have seen a bit in GA, that someone is in development squad at 14, 15, then they don't make an under 16 one, but they're brought back into a larger one at 17, say, for trial stuff. And while they would have had exposure to, a good progressive warm-up, some speed work in development squad training and games at better intensity for the years of 14, 15, possibly some form of S&C block throughout the winter. Then for the year of under 16, just training with the club adds realistically 2 laps and some backs and forwards. Then when they go in at under 17 level, they're like, how come these lads are like that bit faster than me? How come when they name these 4 exercises, the other lads are straight into it? And I'm there looking at them all wondering, what's an inchworm? Just even simple things like that to help players along. That's not a case of while their overall growth or something like that may have stopped them from staying on a panel from 15 to 16. It's other things that they can't really do anything about that stops them progressing from 16 to 17.
Yeah, exactly. And look, it's no fault of the clubs and stuff. It's down to what knowledge they've been given. And so the whole aim then is that the pathway documents essentially that we would have get shared with clubs and get shared with schools, and they then, you know, get taught how to use it, and they build their confidence to bring that stuff in at the school level and in at the club level. So if a girl even leaves the under 16s back into school, they've had a flavour of it, but they're not ignoring everything that they've been taught. They get to use it at the club and school level, and they can even help to teach girls in their own squads as well, bring everybody else along, and then maybe if they jump back in at 17, they're more comfortable, they've continued with their work in schools and clubs, and then they're ready to step back into that intensity again. So that'd be the aim. But it's never going to work if you're not going to get everybody bought into the same system and have everybody bought into that strategic development. And if they don't, it doesn't work. But you have to have then somebody within the organisation that's going to try and influence and be the, not so much the controller, but the puppeteer, I suppose, and just make sure it all flows and that everybody is getting the right information out.
Just the coordinator, really. Excuse me. Just without knowing any hockey clubs or schools like that, but I could just hypothetically see a situation where you have a school who is possibly overperforms for maybe their size or maybe something like that, and they have their own little systems within that they work off. You could potentially see someone like that being like, no, why are we fitting in and doing what everyone else is doing when this is what's made us that little bit better or that above the norm?
Yeah, and you have that. And the thing is that you don't, if especially with Hockey Ireland now, if they're going to make this development pathway and improve the pathway, it can't be a one size fits all either, and it can't be everyone do this in this particular way, coach it like this, and we all play for Ireland. That's not going to happen. So it's a case of giving that blueprint in the sense of, this is ideal and these are the things that we'd like to see included, but you as the coach have the absolute autonomy to coach it however you want. But as long as we're including this element, the players learn about this, they know about this, we're ticking this box. So when we move between squads, or say if a player is playing with senior club and school and Ireland and Leinster or Munster, and they've got 4 different coaches telling them 4 different things, then okay, how about we're all telling them the same thing, but we're coaching it differently. Okay, and tactically the game might look different in all those different teams, which is fine, but they're still learning the same skills. They're still, trying to train at the same intensities. They're understanding how S&C maybe helps, the understanding about nutrition and recovery and that type. Those conversations are happening, and then that's how we can get that development along.
I suppose it's going to, there's always going to be pushback from existing coaches. It's going to be long term. It's just going to be educating them, and then hopefully getting a step closer to following the plan each 6 months or each year, and then eventually it'll be kind of just second nature. It'll always be there embedded in the game.
Yeah, I mean, it's never going to happen overnight, but and it's going to take a few years for culture to change as well. And look, my PhD is looking into it. I'm giving some feedback based off the data to Hockey Ireland, and they're going to put the plan together and to fit the culture that's there already and how they can improve it and whatnot. And it's they've already kind of started that development of the pathway in a sense. It's already been there. They're just kind of tweaking it. It's not something that's brand new. They're just tweaking it and rolling it out again in a way that hopefully coaches are going to buy into and can help them.
That's really interesting.
Is there, I suppose, going off a little bit of a different way, is there any area that you would like to look into after this? Is there any area that you're like, that's another big mammoth of an undertaking that you'd like to get into once you've gotten through this PhD and all that? Or is this kind of like, this is your baby, this is the one?
Yeah, I actually haven't thought about it because I already have a mammoth trying to get through this PhD.
That's fair.
Yeah, no, look, I like the whole talent development end. I love the area of youth athlete development, and being able to take, you know, a 14-year-old through a whole program and progress them to senior level, I think is a really exciting area to work in, and then understanding how that works, because obviously I'm working with senior athletes within the international program, and that's great, and they come to me at a certain age or level, and there's so much that you can do with them. But in that youth group and that pathway of developing up along, there's so many variables and there's so many different things you can, you know, coach and teach and educate on, and having them learn it and understand it, and year on year they change so much and you can influence it so much that I kind of find that area really exciting. So it's a toss up between, I really like developing younger players towards the senior level, but I love working at the senior level. So yeah, to answer your question, I have no idea, but I'm enjoying it at the moment.
It's a great answer.
No, that's great so far. Just in terms of progression to PhD, you're probably past the halfway mark there now. Have you more studies lined up, or do you spend the next while just analysing what you have and trying to make as much sense as possible of it all?
Yeah, so currently I'm looking at all the GPS data that we've collected and trying to analyse that and look at some kind of looking at variability between matches. So looking at match to match variability over the course of the season, and then looking at player variability within games and between games. So I'm trying to wrap my head around all of that analysis.
Is that like time series analysis? Is that how you
it's I'm looking at mixed modelling. So like linear mixed modelling between just different variability patterns. Don't ask me to explain it to you yet, because I'm not 100% sure yet, John.
No, I'm trying to figure out linear mixed model at the minute as well. My head's about to explode.
You can come back to me in a couple of weeks. And then I'm looking at, after that, into the psychological competencies end. And so there's Anya has a questionnaire already developed and validated on that. So I'll use that to look at the different age groups and what they're showing versus the senior level. If our senior athletes in Irish hockey, for example, are all predominantly ticking these characteristics, so whether that's they all value imagery, they all have really good goal setting, they're all really determined, that type of thing, but maybe we're seeing parts missing along the pathway, then how can we try and incorporate ways of developing that in our athletes so that by the time they get to under 21s and senior level, they're psychologically ready for that level too,
That's actually really interesting now. That's really interesting. I think that's just brought us over the hour mark there now. So thanks a million for your time there, Orla. Damien or Shane, if you want to hop in with any other questions.
No, that was brilliant.
No, that's fantastic.
Really informative.
Yeah, it's just like such a broad range of stuff. We could have spent an hour chatting about any one particular topic there, but trying to show off all your strengths there. You'll also see or hear an episode of Orla on the Coaching Bubble podcast with Stephen as well, which you touched more so on the coaching side of things as opposed to more of the data, S&C, sports science side of things as well. That's it. So thanks very much for your time, Orla, and hear everyone next week.
Having me.